Actually, what dying and death has taught me, and I believe it can teach all of us, is that through accepting and embracing the impermanence of everything, we realize the importance of really rooting into our presence in any one given moment. Hey, I'm Tanya Wilkinson, and this is Death on the Daily, bringing the conversation about death out of the shadows and into the mainstream. Because along with birth and change, if there's one thing that's going to happen to us all, then death is it. And we're going to explore how death actually shows up for us on the daily in a multitude of ways, and how when we allow ourselves to accept and to be with death, how it can teach us a whole heap about how to live this life well. So today is the first episode, and it's my first solo podcast episode as well. So today I'm going to be rooting into my why for Death on the Daily. I am a little bit nervous sharing this story because I made a commitment when I set up my coaching business to bring more of me, all of me, to the table to speak my truth. But in truth, it's an ongoing journey. Having been conditioned to wear a mask and, always plaster a smile on and stuff that I'm slowly reprogramming out. This is definitely the rawest and the openest, the most open that I've ever gone. So today what I'm going to be sharing is my very personal story of loss and grief. And before I do, I want to shine a compassionate spotlight just in case you're listening and you've been personally affected by any of these topics or those adjacent. I will be covering topics of miscarriage, of termination for medical reasons, and of stillbirth in this podcast. And if you've been personally affected by any of these, I am sending you lots of love because I know how difficult this journey is. I am continuing to navigate my path of grief and of healing, and I've come to accept that. For me, I know this is a lifelong journey. I've got what I call my little tattoo of grief that just is right here, just over my heart. It's humming away each and every day, and that is like a tattoo. It's lifelong. It's not going anywhere. So, with that little tattoo of grief humming within me, let's talk about it. Let's talk about where this tattoo came from. So I'm going to tell you the story about our daughter who we lost last year. And her name is Ngākau Raiona, which means lioness heart in Māori. And I share her name purposefully because her name is important, because she existed, because she's my daughter. She is my daughter who made me a mother. And the reason I wanted to start here with her name is because for me, not just in pregnancy loss, but in general, sort of in conversations with others in community around where our society has gone in sort of really pushing death and grief into the shadows, us not even feeling comfortable to speak someone's name who's departed from this earth is something that's really, really prevalent. And for me, when I speak her name, I beam. When someone else speaks her name, I also beam ear to ear. And actually, I appreciate that her name is, perhaps one that is more difficult to pronounce. It's my partner's Māori language. And so I'm very, very happy for you to call her Lioness Heart, which is what her name means. And Lioness Heart she is. So I wanted to start with her name and really rooting into her as a personality who from preconception, I could hear her. She is cheeky. She is just like her daddy, and she actually looked just like her daddy. Absolute Māori princess with just, the most beautiful, beautiful little face. And in my mind, the voice that I can hear of her little soul as well, the cheekiest and most beautiful personality. Now, you might be sat here thinking, okay, so what the hell happened then? Let me tell you a brief story of my journey with our little lioness heart. So Ngākau Raiona, our lioness heart, she came into our world last year. I found out in spring I was pregnant, and I was literally jumping for joy doing cartwheels, because it's been a long journey, actually. When I was in my final year working in Formula One, I found out that I had autoimmune hypothyroid. And I basically since then, since 2021, have been on a healing journey to get myself to the place where my body was sort of, don't want to say fully healed from hypothyroid, because it's a lifelong condition, but where my body was healed and where I felt that vitality, having really depleted myself sort of across the whole of my 14-year corporate career. So she came into our world, and I'm not going to go into pregnancy. Honestly, I could talk about her and pregnancy and everything all day. But I will zero us into, I suppose, the 0 point, the epicenter of our loss. So last August, I was cruising on through. I was 5 months pregnant, and I went in for my 20-week scan. And in the scan, the sonographer said there's something on the back of her skull. I can see a little cyst. Don't know what it is. You're going to need to come back next week after the bank holiday weekend and see a fetal medicine consultant. Now, I won't go into details on that weekend, but all I will tell you is there was a hell of a lot of stressing, of Googling, everything. But fast forward through what was actually for me the slowest weekend of my life. Fast forward to the Tuesday, and we were back in the hospital, and we were seeing the fetal medicine consultant. Now, what transpired was that Ngākau Raiona had a birth defect that's called encephalocele. So what she had, I'm not a medical expert, so I don't know if there's different types of encephalocele. I'm going to tell you what she had. She basically had a part of her skull that hadn't formed properly, which meant that part of her brain was on the outside of her skull. And I'm being really open here because actually I want to get these conversations out there. I feel really comfortable talking to it. And I want others to feel comfortable to be able to sit in this conversation with me, because actually it's really, really healing for anyone who's going through loss to be able to speak their truth and speak to their experience. And perhaps, and actually, they probably will need to do it time and time again with that repetition to help them to really embed, accept, and move through. So let me continue in this journey then. So obviously that was the most devastating moment of my entire life. Something that I hadn't even comprehended could even happen at that stage of pregnancy. I actually think that, you sort of, there's again, a cultural expectation. You get through the 12 weeks, everything's going to be fine. Sometimes it isn't. And that was in my case with our baby girl. So Jordan and I, my wonderful partner, who I should have introduced earlier in this conversation, Jordan and I were obviously absolutely devastated. And in that moment in the hospital, when I was lying on the bed for the scan and she was doing it and she was telling us the diagnosis, I completely disconnected. And the consultant actually said, "Are you okay?" And it was that moment that I connected into my body and into my mind. And I thought, I'm not even here. So I voiced it and I said, I've completely disconnected. I'm not in my body right now. In my mind, am somewhere like by the side of the car. I want to go home. I just want to get the hell out of here. I don't even know where I'm floating, but I'm somewhere that's not in this room. Voicing it, I called myself back in and I thought, okay, you've got to listen to this. You've got to understand. So I tried my hardest. I did my best. I'm not saying that I was present at all points. And actually, sometimes our body is doing its best to protect us, and that is totally okay. Now, what's transpired from that scan is that actually that's become a hotspot where I am now being treated for PTSD symptoms that's rooted in that scan moment and that disconnection, disassociation that happened. So then obviously I'm floating through this story, just giving you a few little tasters, because actually through Death on the Daily, through conversations with others, through my writing as well, and sort of all the other stuff that I'm doing, the whole of this story will come out and be spoken to. But for now, I'm going to fast forward us again to the car ride home from the hospital. And I remember Jordan squeezing my hand at every point that he could and looking at me, and we were both in tears as we journeyed home. And I spoke to my friend Christiana, who is actually going to be a guest on the second episode of this podcast series, because we're really going to be rooting into that community care and connection side of things. So I'm not going to say too much about our conversation and sort of why it was so important in this journey. But after that conversation, I hung up the phone and I slumped back into my seat, completely, spiraling between disbelief and my world coming crashing around me. In that moment, our baby girl decided to start kicking. I felt those familiar little flutters that I'd been feeling for the past sort of week or so. And I realized then and there, she's still here. She's still with me. She's still live and literally kicking. And so what I did in that moment was I felt just an absolute call to my duty as a mother. To our baby girl, I whispered, "I'm here with you, baby. I'm not going to leave you. No matter what, I love you." As I cradled and stroked my beautiful, beautiful bump. And as I'm speaking to her, I continue to feel those little lioness-hearted kicks within me. And I just knew in that moment, I knew I can be present. I can be by her side no matter what. And you know what? I am still so in awe of myself and of her for is the fact that we were in it. We were in it together. From that moment onwards, I have the richest memories, in good and in absolutely devastatingly bad. They're all there for me. I somehow found a real sense of presence through that sense of purpose for my daughter. And what I didn't appreciate until later is that actually that was her gift to me, because in doing that and feeling that duty and that obligation to her, I actually gave myself the greatest gift. I believed in myself. I believed that even in those moments where I felt like I was on my hands and knees, literally crawling, and how the hell am I going to get through this alive? I trusted in myself, and I trusted in that which I could hold. And what followed was the most poignant, painful, meaningful, and joyful couple of weeks. Now, the joyful on the end might make you think, huh? What? How? But, and this is as I was reading Rob Delaney's book, A Heart That Works, and he talks of a rainbow of grief, that there's all colors of grief. And actually, when we are present in our grief and in those moments where we are witnessing or with those who are dying, that actually we realize there is also beautiful, poignant, meaning-making moments, whether that's of joy, of peace, of purpose, to be found in that rainbow alongside the devastation, the sadness, the anger, everything else that comes up in our grief journeys. So what flowed was beautiful moments, and how I did that was really rooting into ritual. It was meaning making with my baby girl and with Jordan in the precious few days that we had left before she departed me in spirit and then physically departed my body through her stillbirth. So what I knew was from her, I'm darting all over a bit. I hope, if you can tell, I haven't scripted this because I wanted it to be really organic and just flow where I feel called to. But I suppose actually it's important to give you a little bit of context of sort of what the prognosis was for her before we go into the next few days. But basically, we were told that with her encephalocele, at best, she was going to live for 36 hours outside of the womb after birth. And that's if she survived to that point. So we were given the choice. Do we want to continue with the pregnancy, knowing that that would be her fate, the outcome? Or did we want to go through what's called a termination for medical reasons, which is basically an abortion for a medical reason, like a birth defect in her case. Now, knowing that she was not gonna live, and she was actually gonna suffer in that short space of time that she was born, and actually she would have suffered in the womb too, because the amniotic fluid is not kind to exposed brain tissue. So knowing all of that, you know, obviously there wasn't really much of a choice to make for us. So we said, yep, you know, let's go through with it, and let's do it as quickly as possible to make sure that she is well cared for and that she can exit in peace. So basically, after we got home from that fateful hospital appointment, we knew that we would be getting a second opinion the next day. And then we knew that if that confirmed the worst that had already been confirmed to us, that we were going to be going through with that. And later that day, the next day, we would be going back into the hospital so that I could take the drugs, which would basically end my pregnancy. But when I felt her kicking within me, I knew she's alive now. She's alive now. And I really, really felt that obligation to her and to me and to Jordan. And actually, Jordan was also really helping this he continued to take the bump photos and made sure that I captured lots of memories and started writing everything down to really help me to process and meaning make in these most devastating moments. And feeling her alive and kicking within me, I knew, okay, let's root into ritual now, baby girl. Let me celebrate you. Let me celebrate you until your dying day. And beyond, obviously, because I still celebrate her. And that I did. So what I did was I just created as many little rituals and meaning moments that I possibly could. So there was a song, there's an affirmation song that I'd been listening to, and I'd been singing to actually through pregnancy. And I just adjusted the lyrics to honor her in her final chapter. So, you know, there was a lot of me in between, obviously a huge amount of tears, of anger, of all of the stages of grief, all the bargaining, the denial, etc. When I had those moments of clarity and I had those moments of energy, I let myself dance around the house with her. I let myself sing to her. I let myself speak to her. I lit candles all around the house. I was cooking my favorite meals so that she, through the placenta, could get that yumminess. I don't know if babies can really taste, but so she could, you know, experience that yumminess and all of these little things that just really connected me into her. What else I did was I started to write what would before have seemed absolutely unfathomable for me to ever do it. But I started to write what I called her birth and death plan. So this was inspired by my study. So actually, just before I became pregnant, I trained to be an end-of-life doula. And with the support of the wonderful doulas who I trained with, I created this plan. And actually, if you're listening, you don't know what an end of life doula is. It's basically a companion for someone at the end of their life. And that's both on the practical side, helping with a lot of the sort of practicalities of, this is my plan for in my dying, this is what's most important to me, to the paperwork that you need to do, all the way through to the sort of holding space and emotional support and many, many other things for the person who's dying as well as for their family. So I trained in that, and I had the absolute privilege of my fellow doulas to support me in my journey as I prepared for the death and then the birth of my daughter. So I wrote out her birth and death plan and packed it with ritual. It also included all the practicalities of when I'm in hospital, this is what I do and I don't want. And then beautiful, beautiful rituals that were expanded actually within the group of doulas that I trained with. There's a couple who, unfortunately, they'd had stillbirths. And so they offered up some gentle suggestions of rituals that had really helped them to create meaning and beautiful, beautiful memory. So wrote that all out. And actually, one of my lessons in navigating this path is that the anticipation of certain things, like writing her death and birth plan, like planning her little woodland burial, the anticipation of them was actually worse than just getting started. And what I found is that actually in doing those, I guess the more practical side of things, as well as writing everything down, again, a process that some days I was just like, I can't do this. I can't put pen to paper. Again, it was that anticipation that was stopping me, almost protecting me from the hurt that I assumed would come. But actually, it was really cathartic, allowing myself to just be there, to be there in these more practical side of things and to be there in these rituals. And that helped my healing and my finding of acceptance no end. So the rituals were real meaning makers for me in the whole of this path. And I won't go into, again, too much detail because I don't have the time on this podcast, but of her death that happened. But basically, I went in on the Wednesday to take the drugs to stop the pregnancy. Then I went home and it was just wait until Friday, then you're going to come in and we're going to induce her birth. I had to go through the full induction, whole shebang, and stillbirth, albeit of a much smaller baby than a normal one. And I went home after taking those drugs at the hospital, and I knew that obviously the chapter would be coming to a close soon. So continue to root into those rituals. And then the following night, it was the full moon eclipse in Pisces. And she's definitely a moon guided baby because I found out I was pregnant on the full moon it was a full moon eclipse in Scorpio, and it was a super blue moon. Get it right. It was a super blue moon in Pisces that when she died. And yeah, I found out that I was pregnant on the full moon eclipse in Scorpio. So moon to moon, we had a full, beautiful arc, but it's super blue moon. And I woke up in the night and I just felt a real urge. I'd obviously had really disrupted sleep anyways, since that first 20-week scan, but I felt a real urge to go downstairs and to look at the moon. So I went downstairs, looked at the moon, sung to her, rocked her, and spoke to her and said, I love you. I love you. And when you're ready to let go, you let go. It's okay. And that night she died. And it's okay if you can't tell. Just shed a few tears for our baby girl. And a big part of this podcast is that it's okay to cry. It's okay. Because actually, when I speak to this and when I get upset, it's not just sadness. It's joy. It's remembering her little face. It's remembering our journey together, remembering everything that she has given me in this life and that she continues to give me as I journey through it. So after seeing the super blue moon, I felt a real call. I was like, okay, I've got to open a window. So I went upstairs and opened a little window in the room actually that I'm sitting in, which was going to be her nursery. So I opened the window and went back to bed. It was a bit of a cold night. And so actually it was quite unusual for me to open the window up, but just did. And then the next morning, I realized that actually the kicking had stopped. So I honored her in that moment. I knew, and I was so grateful. And I was grateful that I was there to sing to her and to say some final words to her before she went off, before she released out into the skies, into the universe. And then the following day, we were going into the hospital for her induction and birth. And obviously, I'd been dreading it. I didn't know what to expect. I hadn't been able to go through any of the, the usual, what you do before you go through birth and all the contractions and the whole shebang. You do hypnobirthing classes or whatever it is. So, I was completely unprepared because at 20 weeks, for me, I wasn't quite there in preparing myself for what would come. And obviously for me, that came sooner and with very different circumstances. So we went into the hospital. Prior to that, Jordan made sure we did a little walk in the woods and we got the bump photo. And it was just a really wonderful way to send her off and her last walk with us. And when we went into the hospital, it was truly awe-inspiring and incredible. Painful at moments, but actually also, I can't explain the joy. I can't explain the joy that came in her birth. And that might seem really bizarre. And like, where the hell did that come from? How could that be joyful? But there was just something about meeting our little lioness-hearted one, Ngākau Raiona, our little princess. And she came, thankfully, quite quickly. So I think I was induced at 10 p.m. and she was here by 4 a.m. So it was short, sharp, and very, very painful. But actually, there was just moments that Jordan and I both said we will never, ever forget. Even when they collapsed the vein in my hand when they put the stent in, which I think was probably the most painful thing of the whole experience, obviously, other than the emotional pain, but the physical pain, horrendous. And even in that, like, I remember Jordan he's very funny and he cracked a joke at just the perfect time. And it just snapped me back into the room. I was literally I'm not very good with like needles and stuff like that. And I have a bit of a history of like fainting and things. And he just brought me back in. And that sort of set the tone of us as a trio. We were in it together. Obviously, Ngākau Raiona was no longer with us in spirit, but in body she very much was. And we were so lucky and so honored to meet her. And you had some real landmark moments like my water's breaking, like her birth was just incredible. And I remember Jordan being like, oh my goodness, look at her. And she looked exactly like him. What I'd always known since before pregnancy, I knew that I was having a girl and I knew that she would look the spit of Jordan, and she did. And and I'm literally beaming talking about this. And then we had the most precious, I think we stayed at the hospital from her birth through to at 4 a.m. through to after midday with her. Loads of rituals. We bathed her. We got her dressed. We took loads of photos. Did Everett sung to her as well, the whole lot, anointed her with beautiful oils that I'd brought. And loads of beautiful meaning making rituals, using all of the senses as well, like even with the oils that I brought. And when I smell them now, I just think of her and it makes me smile. It literally makes me beam ear to ear. It's just, honestly, it was obviously devastating and obviously not anything I could have ever fathomed going through, but the resilience that I have, as well as the beauty in the darkest moments, are things that I'm still integrating and still just so in awe of this human existence, and in awe of us when we can call ourselves to presence, if we're able to, because I appreciate sometimes we're not. And if the body dissociates and it's trying to protect itself, then, I'm not saying that we should always be present. I definitely wasn't in this journey, but with that conscious call to presence, I'm so pleased that with that sense of purpose for my daughter, I managed to stay there. I managed to stay in it with her, and I received and continue to receive so many gifts from it, from that experience and from her. Ultimately, this is her legacy. So I want to wrap up this conversation with those lessons that I learned from our beautiful little lioness-hearted one. And I want to start with the power of presence, because that, for me, is my, I suppose, landmark experience of being able to call myself back into presence. And now whenever I feel myself disconnecting from a situation, I always say to myself, hey, look what you went through. You can be here now. Come on. But actually, it's that intention that brought me back. And for me, it was rooted in me being present for her. But actually, I realized that her gift was me actually being present as well for myself. And I realized that I owe myself that. I owe myself calling myself back in difficult times. How can I say those words to myself? I will be here for myself no matter what. I'm not going to leave me. Because actually in doing so, I open myself up to receive any of that meaning, and other gifts that do come in those difficult moments, including those glimmers of joy along the way. Even in our darkest moments in this journey, Jordan and I had so many moments of big belly laughs, of talking about our memories of this, beautiful journey with our daughter, including in those tough times where we're just both beaming from ear to ear, and we're so connected with each other and with her. So there's real power of presence. And when we purposefully call ourselves back into presence in difficult moments, there are definitely so many gifts to be found. And included within that, for me, is my second lesson from our little lioness-hearted one, which is that, like the contractions that I went through in her birth, like the waves of grief that are like contractions, it's very much that sort of like searing pain of grief, and then that light relief, and you sort of can get clarity, feel a bit of joy, whatever else comes flooding in. I realized that everything in life is impermanent. And this is one of the gifts when we can be present with death, is that we realize that death is a teacher of our impermanence, much like everything in life is. Careers, they change, at some point they end, relationships as well. At some point, we're going to have to say goodbye to everybody who we love. Now, instead of getting consumed by that and fearful of the forwards path, actually what dying and death has taught me, and I believe it can teach all of us, is that through accepting and embracing the impermanence of everything, we realize the importance of really rooting into our presence in any one given moment, whether that's to enjoy our time with our family, or whether that's when we're riding those waves of grief, realizing that actually that the sort of the depths of our grief, that is impermanent. And we will emerge at some point. And actually, when we can be present, including in the depths of our grief, we also can find greater presence when we emerge and have that relief of life, even just for a few minutes, a day, or whatever it is, starting to feel some sort of new normal again. So there's real power when we can accept that everything in this life is impermanent. My third lesson from our little lioness is that also through finding presence in dying and death, that actually we ourselves transform. We heal forwards. So actually who we are as we come through grief is not who we were before it. Every time I've been through a big loss, the world changes. And actually, when I allow for that transformation of myself, which basically means shedding the former versions of myself, transformation is a permanent change. You know, it's not a switch to a new version and then switch back. And when we allow ourselves to heal forwards and we allow ourselves to be open to the lessons of death and of grief and how they can root us, whether that's into our purpose, our values, what's most important to us in life, realizing we're all impermanent and actually let's make the most of this life in the now. That transformation, to me, is the legacy of those who've departed us. I feel the legacy of our little lioness-hearted one. Her lioness heart is roaring inside of me. It's literally right where that tattoo of grief is. She speaks through me. She has changed everything in this life. Even me here doing this podcast, even me shedding some tears in public on this podcast, that is all her legacy. And I'm so, so excited to be sitting here with you. And I'm so excited to continue the conversation through Death on the Daily and to be continuing the conversation with many, many other brilliant people about their journeys with death and how death shows up for us on the daily. That is a legacy of my little lioness. And I believe through us being present with death and dying and taking forwards those lessons for us as the living and creating that legacy of the person who has departed, I believe that's how we deepen our ripple effect in the world. That's how we create those tidal waves of change. There's a real urgent need for us to relearn and be present with death individually so that we know that we can hold it, we can be present with it, and we can receive all of the gifts that do come in these most difficult of moments, as well as being present with death in community, connection, and care for each other. And then obviously in wider culture and society, transforming this world. Because actually, if you look at everything that's happening out in the world, we've got a real problem where there's generations and generations and generations of grief that has just been sort of pushed into the shadows and locked away. But actually, I believe that we would be a much kinder, fairer, more caring and compassionate society if only we open ourselves up to be present for that which we as humans assume is the worst, when actually death really is. It's all around us, and it's in our power to move through it with presence. So that wraps up the first episode of Death on the Daily, a pretty heavy one. I also have lots more to share in this space, and I'm sure that it's going to be coming out as well, a lot other fragments of my story with Ngākau Raiona and Jordan in the coming weeks and the coming episodes, because actually through these conversations that I'm going to be having with others as well as solo reflections, it's really about bringing more of these conversations out of the shadows and into the mainstream. And we're not just going to be talking about physical death. We're going to be also talking about where else in our life death is present. So, for example, job loss, relationship loss, friendships as well. You know, sometimes we move on and we actually have to leave behind friends who are no longer in alignment, as well as, you know, our health, our personal transformations. You know, there's a multitude of ways where death and sometimes grief shows up. And actually, if we're present to it and we start this conversation, we realize that power when we can root into those periods of dying and death, however they manifest in our lives. Because actually, when we look out to nature, you look at nature, nature's got all 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter. And actually, what we have in our society is we're trying to live in a perpetual spring and summer. But when we embrace all of the seasons, we really can experience and live life in all of its richness. All of my gratitude to you for joining me for another Dead Conversation. Death on the Daily is edited by David Strutt. The music is Set Free by Katie Gray. And I am Tanya Wilkinson. And if you enjoyed this episode, I would be over the moon if you can rate, review, and subscribe. It really, really helps me to get the word out there. And if you want to say hi or to hear more about my work as a coach and death doula, including how I support my clients to navigate their death on the daily, then all of the ways that you can connect with me are in the show notes. I'll be back soon with some more Dead Conversations. And in the meantime, take good care of yourself and others.
There's a cold fire, there's a crossfire, and there's something inside. And we'll never make it, and we'll never break